All right, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. Like you said, I'm Steve Faulkner. I'm at South Pole Steve on Twitter or on GitHub or on any other part of the internet. So if you're ever looking for me, that's how you find me. I did go to the South Pole once a long time ago in a different career, so that's a story for later. I came here all the way from Philly, land of cheesesteaks and Rocky and all kinds of stuff like that. So if you're in Philly or nearby, stop and say hi. As you said, I work for Bustle. So for those of you not familiar, Bustle is one of the largest women's media properties online. So depending on whose numbers you believe, we're somewhere in the top 30 websites in the US. A lot of editorial content. I am the director of platform engineering, which is just the fancy way of saying I'm kind of in charge of all things backend. But we have kind of a very cross-disciplinary team, so touch a lot of different things in the front end too, occasionally. So this talk is broken down into 6 different sections. First I'm going to talk about the hype of serverless. So, I mean, there's a lot of people here, so hopefully you're all hyped on it, but maybe not. Maybe you've seen just some of the hashtags out there and the tweet storms and whatnot. So you're here to figure out what's actually going on. I'm going to talk about Serverless 101, why it exists, why we're talking about what the word actually means, why you may want to use it, why you might want to use it, and then I'll talk about what we actually do with it at Bustle and some of the tooling lastly. So, hype first. This is a Medium post called Your Buzzword for 2016, Serverless. It was written in March of 2016, so didn't even get like more than a few months in and it was already proclaimed the buzzword of the year. There's all kinds of great tweets I've collected about serverless. I don't have time to go over all of them. This is probably my favorite comment ever that I've ever read. I also hate it when people put walls of text on slides, but I'm going to do it because it's my talk, do what I want. But I'm going to read it. The people who are serving websites on Lambda or something are not only doing it wrong, they are wasting money while locking themselves into an architecture that doesn't fit their app. This is on Hacker News. So my first reaction to this is I should probably hire this person because they know more about my app than I do. So commonly, I give this talk a few times before. I talked to a lot of people about serverless. I hear it doesn't scale, it's not production ready, it's too slow, it's too expensive. So I'm here to tell you that all of these things are completely false. At Bustle, to give you kind of a preview of the later part of the talk, we use serverless technologies for 99% of our user requests. That results into AWS Lambda specifically 10 to 20 million calls per day, less than 200 milliseconds average latency, and it costs us less than our EC2 base setup. So I'm here to tell you it actually does work in production for us. So I'm going to tell you about all that and maybe it will work for you too. Serverless 101, I'm going to talk about kind of how we got to where we are. First off, there are still servers. This is like the first thing everybody says. They're like, there's still servers. All right, yes, I get it. I know that's a terrible word. I did not come up with the word serverless. I don't know what market agency did, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, it's kind of what has been used as the buzzword around a certain set of practices. And those practices are basically what if we abstracted all the servers away? And this is not really like a very new concept. Stuff like this has been happening for a long time. It's usually called whatever as a service. There's lots of things that claim to do this or claim to be this. There's this one critical missing part though. Every time somebody has blank as a service, they never really address the question of, okay, where does my business logic go? Where does the stuff that actually matters to my specific application live? And there's been a lot of different approaches to try to fix this. Something like Firebase or Parse was kind of like, well, put all the logic on the client, right? And we're not gonna, let you do anything there. Heroku's kind of in this vein, although they still make it very aware that you have a server, you have to scale up manually all of your processes. So this talk's really not about those things. Those are interesting things and interesting tools, but maybe the fact that one of them doesn't exist can tell you why we're not really talking about those in 2016. What we're really talking about in 2016 when we talk about serverless is we're really talking about functions as a service. People are trying to kind of glom onto serverless and say, oh, our app is also serverless, our service is also serverless. But really this is like the core thing. This is business logic going into functions as a service. A few core tenets of functions as a service. So run my code only when I need it. I only want to pay when it's actually running. I don't want to have stuff sitting around waiting. And just don't bother me with the details. I'm at a Node conference, so this is, I think, not a hard sell to say that your app is basically a function that sits between the request and the response of the user. Especially, in the case of web programming, we're all programming in basically an invented language. So who's actually kind of doing this stuff, offering functions as a service? Well, Azure has a thing called, I think it's called Azure Functions. Google has Google Cloud Functions. IBM has this very interesting thing called OpenWhisk that is actually open source. So if you kind of want to see how maybe this works underneath the hood, highly encourage you to check those things out. This talk is not about any of those things. This talk is about Amazon Web Services, and I'm very excited with some of the progress that's being made by everybody else in this arena, but honestly, Amazon is pretty far out ahead of everybody else, and the reason that everybody's so hyped on serverless, I think, has a lot to do with Amazon's specific offering, and it's what we use at Bustle. So, being the Hitchhiker's Guide, I'm gonna kind of get into some specific details and talk about what that actually looks like. Side note. reInvent is literally happening right now. People at Amazon are announcing things as I'm talking, so something in this talk may be completely wrong by the time I get out of here. So we'll see what happens. All right, let's look at some code. So this is sort of a pseudo express app. The simplest thing I could possibly come up with. And there's actually two different things happening here. There is routing, and there is functions, right? This is your business logic, and there's something that says, hey, here's the proper function you actually need to call. So it turns out we actually need two things. We need functions as a service, and we also need routing as a service. And Amazon provides both of those for us. One is called Amazon Lambda, and one is called AWS API Gateway. Going to dive into kind of a little bit more about what each of those is. Lambda. This is what it looks like. I put this slide up here because I find Amazon's UI to be incredibly confusing, and so if you're in here, you're in the right place. Lambda is actually really simple. You write code, you zip it, you upload it, and then they will run it. It's not, the model around Lambda is not super complicated. Or you can actually run them in multiple languages, first-class support for Node, Java, Python. Plus with a Node shim, it's pretty easy to run any binary compiled language, so there's a lot of options there. Everybody always freaks out when I talk about Lambda for the first time because they're like, oh my gosh, it's going to be some super specific Amazon thing. No, it's not. It's totally okay. You're going to survive. It is basically just like normal Node functions. It's a callback-based model. You call back to the caller, which happens to be Amazon or some end user request, and you give them some data, either an error or a success result. On top of this, Amazon gives you all this stuff that you're going to want. So when you first start out, deploy a function, pretty easy, this is really cool. But at some point when you're doing this in production, you're going to need versioning. You want to have multiple versions of these functions. You're going to want to alias those versions. You're going to say version 45 is the beta version, version 46 is the production version. Maybe switch those around when you're ready to promote things to production. They give you some controls over RAM and CPU. They give you a bunch of logging stuff. With any kind of distributed system or microservices style architecture, this is often the biggest problem is how do we aggregate all these logs in one place? As frustrating sometimes as Amazon's CloudWatch UI is, it is nice to have everything all in one place. And then also non-HTTP events. So Lambda actually used to be that you couldn't really respond to HTTP events with it. It was only for kind of back-end processing requests, like an S3 bucket got updated or a DynamoDB table got updated, things like that. API Gateway. So it's actually my pretty firm belief that the reason serverless has seen such a big rise is because Amazon released API Gateway. They released it maybe a little over a year and a half ago. Before that, Lambda had been around. It wasn't, used a ton, but it was definitely something that already existed. And this is really the key that unlocked Lambda. Lambda is the interesting part. API Gateway is the thing that kind of got us to the interesting part. So this is what API Gateway looks like. The way you use it is you click around a lot. This has gotten a little bit better recently, and so I'll touch on some of that later. But mostly it's a lot of UI work. On top of that, on top of just routing to your functions, you're going to get all this stuff that you wanted anyways. Caching, throttling, authorization. You can do a bunch of other things there. You can bring your own custom auth. You can do IAM-based stuff if you're already in the AWS ecosystem. Gives you ways to generate and provision API keys, set up logging and metrics, custom domains, SSL certificates, and lastly, Swagger import and export, which is kind of a recent addition and makes the clicking around less of an issue. So those are kind of the two main components of serverless. I think that when I go around and talk to people about serverless and talk to other people who are doing this stuff, I would say that 95% of the time they're talking about AWS Lambda and API Gateway. So I think that's a fair assumption. I'm very excited where everybody else is going to catch up, but they are definitely leading the pack. So why serverless? It's one of my favorite tweets of all time. I really am very skeptical of new things, and I'm like, okay, I want to really know how this particular set of technologies is going to help me do my job better, help me meet the needs of my business better. That's how I'm always looking at things. So with that in mind, I have a bunch of kind of points about why you might want to do serverless. The first is ops. So everybody always, maybe not at this conference, but when I go to DevOps conferences to talk about serverless, everybody freaks out and is like, this means ops going away. It's not going to go away. Little history, in 2011 I was working at a very small startup, and this was like our ops, right? If Heroku was down, we just went to lunch, because like, what else are we going to do? Now I don't work at a startup, and we have to have a plan. I mean, and that's there's been a lot of progress in the area of making ops better in the last like 5 years. Very excited by a lot of the stuff that's happening there. And then everybody thinks that this is now what serverless people think, right? Serverless ops, like, whatever, there's no servers, doesn't matter. But this is not true at all. So it's not no ops. I hate this hashtag, don't use this hashtag. It might be less ops, but serverless ops is still have a plan. When it comes to AWS Lambda, we were very early kind of in the game, and so we'd spent a lot of time doing these things. We did benchmarking. We spent time trying to do all kinds of crazy hacks to do fallbacks to different regions or different Lambda functions, or even some of our old EC2 stuff. We do a bunch of load testing. We're trying to improve on monitoring. There's a bunch of new tools that have since kind of come out in the last year that have made this a lot easier. Like I said, maybe hashtag less ops. Let's talk about scale. So scaling is always one of those things, everybody says, does it scale, which I don't really know what that means. But I'll use a analogy that I like to use for lots of different programming things, and that's if I give you a pen and tell you to write down your name on a piece of paper, you're like, that's not too bad. If I tell you to do it 100 times, well, okay, that's going to kind of suck, but you could do it. If I tell you to do it 1,000,000 times, right? Suddenly, you have all these other problems, right? Like, you don't have enough paper, you don't have enough ink in your pen. Where's the nearest pen store? Did you ride your bike today so you can get to the pen store? Like, there's all these other questions that crop up when you start scaling things from a conceptual level. Not just how many users do I have, but really what is the load on me? What is the load on my organization, on my team? How are we conceptualizing all this stuff? So I think, and I'm really trying to come up with a way to actually quantify this, but qualitatively, I think that serverless results in less stuff changing between 1 request per second and 1,000 requests per second. That's the benefit to me and to scale as I see it within our organization. We have to do less and change less about how we operate. That doesn't mean that we can just turn things on instantly and all of a sudden we have bazillions of requests and nothing falls down. We still have to be very careful about stuff we're doing, but it means we get to do less, and those changes come easier. Nobody's really talking about this yet, but I'm excited about this part. Does anybody here have that one EC2 box that's still on that you think you might be able to turn off, but you're not really sure, so it's still running in the background, maybe? Yeah. The great part about serverless is you only pay for it when you're using it, so if nobody's using it, you don't pay for it. I don't worry about the functions that are still sitting around that we deployed a year ago, right? At some point I might need to clean up so the UI looks better, but in general, it's not costing me any money, it's not costing my team time. It's great, excited about it. Iteration, I think that it's really nice to be able to kind of iterate on a function-based level rather than your entire application. Single function deployments allow us to deploy things very quickly. They also allow us to experiment. If you want to rewrite some function, one little part of our app in Rust, we can do that, go for it. And we've kind of done things like that where we've experimented on very small parts. Very quick deploys. Basically, I talked about aliasing and versioning before, but you can deploy a bunch of functions. You could deploy 50 functions, and then you can alias them all at once, which means going, your entire app going from beta to production, kind of doing blue-green style deployments becomes very easy to do. Let's talk about money. So I mentioned before, it's cheaper. I have one really good example of this. I hate when people give examples where they're like, oh, it's cheaper, but we rewrote it and we removed 3 features and it's in a new language and that kind of stuff. But we have this one API. It's actually probably one of our most trafficked APIs. It handles all of our kind of user tracking and event tracking on the website. It's very simple. It's just one node endpoint that kind of collects all this data and puts it into the various places it needs to go. On EC2, it was costing us about $2,500 a month. It was already a Node application. It was one of the very first things we wrote in Node. We moved over to Lambda and API Gateway and went down to $400 a month. So awesome, right? I think honestly we're seeing even higher cost savings in other places, but like I said, a little hesitant to make those comparisons directly. But this is the best example that I have. All right, so why not? I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that serverless is like the most amazing thing. You have to rewrite everything tomorrow in serverless. I think it's great. I think it's going to be a game changer moving forward with how we build applications, but there's definitely reasons not to use it. Lock-in is one. Our organization is not, this is not a business need for us. We don't really care that much about lock-in. We love Amazon and they do lots of great things for us and I'm happy to keep using their stuff. I get that this is not the case for everybody. If you're ever locked into Lambda, this is all you need to get out. It's an Express server that calls Lambda functions. If you ever get stuck, just email me. I'll send you this code. I'll charge you for it too. All right, cold functions. All right, this is actually a big one that we worry a lot about, and you definitely should be worried about. I mentioned before that you could also write Lambda functions in Java and in Python. The Java people particularly freak out about this because they have big cold start issues. Because obviously, the first time you call a function, if you're doing something outside the handler like this, like load a bunch of data, then you need to actually process that data. If this happens outside the main part of your function, you need to be worried about how long that takes and how that affects end users. The best data we have on this is your functions actually get cold started guaranteed within 3.5 hours. Just something about how Amazon does their container management behind the scenes. Long running tasks, 5-minute max, so everybody should just be aware of that. The best example I have of this is we have a thing we load from S3 every night, goes into Lambda, and then it gets indexed in Elasticsearch. I thought this was going to be the one thing we couldn't use Lambda for. Comes in at like 4 minutes, so totally good. Testing is definitely an issue. Unit testing individual functions is not too difficult, but when you do one of these, you want to do integration testing across all of your functions or functions calling functions, that's a little bit of a pain point still. So right now we do a lot of testing in the cloud. We spin up new environments specifically for testing. So how we do serverless app bustle. It's actually really simple. This is probably maybe this is why you showed up, but it's probably the most uninteresting part of the talk. On the front end, this is what the Bustle website looks like. All we're doing is we're serving up HTML and JavaScript through API Gateway. We read some static assets out of S3, and we use Lambda to do server-side rendering. So we use both Ember and Fastboot and Preact because we have a couple different properties. And like I said, it comes in, it's plenty performant for our needs. On the back end, basically the same deal. We use now, we've kind of moved over to GraphQL for pretty much everything on the back end. That's what our GraphQL looks like. And same thing, JSON, API Gateway, all done through Lambda, usually talking to DynamoDB or Redis, some Elasticsearch in there, some Postgres. Oh my gosh, I have 1 minute left. Tooling, all right. So, tooling. There is a bunch of great stuff out there that will help you do serverless, help you do API Gateway and Lambda. You need to use one of these things. If you're using more than like 2 functions, it is incredibly painful to deploy this stuff yourself. And honestly, this is the place that we've seen the most improvement in the last year, and I think will continue to improve a lot. Serverless Framework is the oldest thing. They changed their name to this. They used to be called JAWS. I'm not really a fan of the new name because I think it confuses a lot of people. There's a thing called Node Lambda that does a lot of this for you. Apex, which is written in Go but supports all the runtimes, is written by TJ Halachuk, if you're familiar with his work. Also Cloudia.js, which is another very interesting thing, kind of how they architect it. Or you can use the one I wrote. So Shep. Check it out. Shep is Bustle's open source Lambda and API Gateway deployment framework. It's very easy to get, npm install G Shep. The pitch for Shep, compared to some of these other tools, is that it's JavaScript only. That's all we do, and so we think we can build a better product by focusing on that. No CloudFormation or Terraform, because we want fast deploys, and we don't think we can get them with those tools yet. Swagger for import and export. Webpack for actually packaging up functions. Makes a lot of sense and makes your functions faster by deploying only what that function needs. And then lastly, helps you control a bunch of environment variables. Basically, it's really easy to get going with Shep. It only takes 3 commands. Soon, we're going to have the ability to run local servers, documentation, and log stuff. Stream your logs from CloudWatch. And that's it. At South Pole Steve, any questions?
You need to use this for the question?
We're working on the mic.
Almost run out of time, but since there is a break, we can have a couple.
So the framework you mentioned is AWS only, or that is general purpose, the Shep framework you mentioned?
No, Shep is AWS only and will be for the foreseeable future.
Another question here.
How reliable do you find the Lambda function invocation? I mean, are we talking 2 nines, 3 nines, 80%? What kind of error rates are you having on these invocations?
Ooh, so this is something we're trying to get better benchmarks around. I would say that we've seen in the past when we've done, like the last time we did really like some hardcore benchmarking ourselves, we saw stuff around 3 nines. It's not a big business concern of us. We have pretty robust caching and CDN stuff in front of a lot of our content. We don't do payments. I get that the needs of a media company are very specific. We just don't have a lot of cases where, like, if something fails on Lambda, that we can't just run it again. So not to say that that's always true, but it's not something we worry a ton about.
One? No?
No?
This was good.
All
Thank
right,
you very much.
thank you very much.